Hello, I am Pastor David Greg Boone of New Life Brownsville, and I am so excited to be joining with you in your Connect group, and it is an honor of mine to be speaking to you tonight. For the last several weeks, we have been going through a series that is entitled Everyone Has a Story. We have looked at the life of Saul and Ananias. We've also been able to kind of peel back a little bit and look into the life of Rahab. And I'm excited about tonight in spending time in the book of 2 Samuel. We're going to look at the 4th chapter and the 9th chapter. And we're going to pull out an individual from those chapters. His name is Mephibosheth. And I believe by the time we get to the end of this story, you're going to see yourself in his life. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to going into this. When two kings would go to battle and there would be a war, there began to become a tradition that if a king won and he defeated a particular king, if that king had any sons or if he had any grandsons, it was known that they would actually capture them, and most often they would put them to death. The reason behind this was to make sure that any type of future rebellion or any type of revolt to try to reclaim the throne would be absolutely stopped. So this became a typical practice in warfare and in battles when opposing kings and kingdoms were fighting against one another. When we pick up our story in 2 Samuel, the very beginning, we find that King Saul, which is the king over Israel, and his son, which would one day be king, Jonathan, are out fighting in a war. They're in a battle. And in the process of this, something tragic happens. And the fact that King Saul is killed in that battle, and also his son Jonathan. Because of knowing that this tradition that the next in line would most likely be captured and murdered, there was a panic that began to set in Jerusalem. Now, we know that God had already determined that a man by the name of David was going to be the next king, and that David was going to bypass all of the descendants of Saul, and there he was going to be placed upon the throne. When word arrives at Jerusalem that Saul and Jonathan have now been killed in battle, and many of them already knew that David is the next one, that he is to be the next king over Israel, there was a fear that began to arise over King Saul's grandson, which was Jonathan's son, and his name was Mephibosheth. The Bible tells us in 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4, he was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. Now, David had no intention of doing this particular or following this particular tradition, but the family of Saul did not know that. And so because of the panic and the fear, what we read in the Word of God is that a nurse quickly picked up Mephibosheth in her arms. They began to gather the few belongings that they could out of the palace, and quickly they were going to begin to leave Jerusalem and find a place to hide this young heir to the throne, which was the grandson of Saul and was the son of Jonathan. The nurse picks up this child, Mephibosheth, in her arms. She gathers up some other belongings. She places them with her, and all of a sudden she hastily begins to run out of the palace. Making her way down these rock stairs, down into the street, something began to occur to the point that she trips all of a sudden. She stumbles. And like all of us, in a natural reflex, without thinking, she may have threw out one of her arms to brace herself from falling. And whatever transpired, Mephibosheth slips from her arms and he falls hard upon the ground, landing upon both of his legs. And this fall ends up crippling Mephibosheth for the rest of his life. And so as we kind of fast forward, we see that 20 years go by, and Mephibosheth, this grandson of King Saul, this son of Jonathan, we would say a prince, is now far removed from Jerusalem, far removed from royalty or his rightful place, and he's now living isolated. For 20 years, we find that the damage done to him not only affected him physically, but it also affected him mentally. 20 years goes by and he's crippled in both of his feet. He can't walk. He will never walk up to the king. He will never approach the king. He will never have an audience with the king because he believes that his crippledness has forever removed him from any hope of that. On the other side, we have David. 20 years have gone by in David's life. David has now been ruling over Israel. He has been ruling as king in Jerusalem, and Israel has grown tremendously. It's 10 times the size that it was under King Saul. And David is there, and he's in his palace, and 20 years have gone by, and he has now conquered every one of his enemies. He's defeated every army that has risen up against him, and Israel is at a place of peace. We're not sure exactly when it happens. We just know that some moment, some particular day, David is there, and he begins to reflect upon his own life. He begins to reflect upon where he's at now in life, and he begins to think about Jonathan. You see, Jonathan and David were very good friends, very close friends. In fact, one of the problems King Saul had with his own son Jonathan is he could not understand how Jonathan was willing to step back and allow David to step in as the next king. This would cause controversy within the home and controversy between Saul and Jonathan. But Jonathan knew the hand of God was upon David. One day when David was inquiring, should I go back to the palace, Jonathan told him, you need to stay away because my dad is set on killing you. He is set on destroying you. In the process of that conversation Jonathan and David were having, something interesting happens. It's found in 1 Samuel chapter 20. It says in verse 14, this is Jonathan speaking. He says, if I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And Jonathan, he made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies. And then here it is in verse 17. Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. No doubt 20 years later, here is David sitting upon the throne. He is the king over all of Israel, and he begins to think about the covenant that he made with Jonathan, to show Jonathan kindness and to watch over Jonathan's family. And 20 years have gone by, and reflecting upon this moment, he's thinking about the process. He's thinking about the goodness of God and the blessings of God and all the things that God has done for him. And in the moment of that reflection, he recognizes, I haven't fulfilled my covenant to Jonathan. I haven't sought out his family, and I haven't looked for them so that I may bless them and do some good for them. And so we read 2 Samuel chapter 9 verse 1. All of a sudden David asked this question, is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? I find this so moving because People that have been shown grace also want to display grace. When you find someone that they know that where they are was only by the grace and the goodness of God, they are very quick then to want to display it to others. And David here, I think he's starting to recognize, I don't deserve to be here. I don't deserve the blessings of God upon my life. And he said, I want to show some grace. I want to show some mercy. I want to extend that. And David isn't doing it for the applause of people. He's not doing it so everyone will notice and look at him and say, oh man, what a great guy David is. David is doing it from the depths of his soul because he knows, I don't deserve to be sitting where I'm sitting. I don't deserve to be king. I was a shepherd boy. My family is a poor family, a humble family. I don't deserve to be where I'm at. But I know it was because of the mercy and the goodness of God. And so now I want to do that for someone else. And so David here starts asking. There happens to be a servant that was once a servant of King Saul. His name is Siba. And 2 Samuel 9 verse 3, it tells us Siba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. There's one that is still alive. But he continues with what he's saying, and he says, but he's a cripple. He's crippled in both of his feet. He's crippled. Right then, David may have thought to himself, he's now asked for something more than he bargained for. He asked, is there someone still alive? And the servant said, yes, there is, but he's a cripple. He's a cripple. Maybe David instantly began to contemplate in his mind, now that's not going to fit very well for royalty. That doesn't fit very well for the palace. All of the elite people are the ones that are supposed to be coming here, that walk these halls, that dine at my table, that drink the wine that is served here. The very best garments are here, the very best robes, the very best chariots, all of those things. That's what speaks about the palace and being a king. Nothing about a cripple. But we don't read any of that. We don't read that David thought any of that. In fact, what moves me so deeply is the quick response of David. The Bible says that David replied, where is this son? Where is this son? I don't know, that really moves me when I think about that, because David did not consider Mephibosheth's problem. He didn't consider Mephibosheth's situation. You see, he spoke to what Mephibosheth was, and that is, you are called to be a son. So one sentence, David said, we need to find this son. The Bible tells us that he began to inquire, where is this son? They said he lives in a place known as Lo-Debar. The meaning of that little town means a barren place. Mephibosheth was living in a barren place. And David said, let's find him. I need you to gather up some people. Let's go on a rescue mission. Let's go looking for him. And so here we find that they began sending out servants. And they go to Lo-Debar. And they began to search through this barren place, through this humble area, knocking upon every door until they finally arrive at where Mephibosheth was at. Here the servants pick up Mephibosheth. They carry him to the chariot. They place him in that chariot. And then they drive him with all of his belongings to Jerusalem. It is interesting because we know that Mephibosheth reacted to David like how sometimes you and I react. The Bible says that when Mephibosheth came into where David was, into his presence, that he fell down on his face. In fact, he falls down upon his face, and he even looks up at David and he says, what do you want with a dead dog as I? Mephibosheth looked upon himself as someone that was unworthy. He looked upon himself in his condition and said, no one would want to have anything to do with me, especially the king. The king wouldn't want anything to do with me. But I love the response of David. David said, fear not, fear not. Here we find very specifically that David is speaking something that God would speak to all of us. In fact, when God speaks to you and He speaks to me, He never speaks to us according to our past. He doesn't speak to us according to our pain or to our problem. What we find is He speaks to us, our King speaks to us as, you are my son, you are my daughter, you are my child. And Mephibosheth, he's carrying all of this stigma. For 20 years he's carried this stigma of what has happened to him, of his pain. When people would mention his name, they would always mention his problem. But when the king mentioned his name, he called him, you're my son. You're my son. One word from the palace, one word from the king offsets all of the 1,000 voices that are in the street. You're my son. So David brings in Mephibosheth. He says, do not fear. I love that statement. 2 Samuel 9 verse 7, do not fear, do not be afraid. Can I say that God says the same thing to you and I? Are you aware that the most repeated command from Jesus is fear not? Do you know that every book in the Bible makes that statement? Fear not. Fear not. Do not be afraid. Mephibosheth had been called, he had been found, and he had been rescued. But guess what? He still needed some assurance. We all need some assurance now and then. We all need that little reminder that, hey, I am a child of God. I have been adopted. That God is not looking at me according to my past, my pain, my problems, but He's looking to me as His child. And Mephibosheth needed that assurance. Paul speaks to you and I, and he points to the cross as a guarantee that you can look to the cross, that is your assurance. He says in Romans 5 verse 8, but God commanded His love towards us, and that while we were yet sinners, Jesus Christ, He died for us. So God provided His love and proved His love for us. Just as David kept his promise to Jonathan, God so keeps His promise to you and I. I find it fascinating that the name Mephibosheth means he who scatters shame. And that's exactly what David did. David brings Mephibosheth into the palace. He scatters the shame. He erases it by saying, you are forever going to abide here. And this is what David begins to do. He begins to return everything back to Mephibosheth that belonged to him. 2 Samuel 9 verse 7. And David said to him, do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father. And then this is the part that is so powerful. He says, you shall eat at my table always. Not once, but always. And he doesn't just say it once. He says it again in verse 10. Mephibosheth will always eat at my table. He says it again in verse 13. Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. A son that was brought home. A son that ate at the table. A son that was able to come back into the blessings that God had restored unto him. I ask you here tonight, do you see our story in Mephibosheth? I certainly do. I see the crippling effects of sin, what sin has done because of the fall, the way it has permanently damaged us, the way that it has hurt us, even driving us away from the King, living lonely lives within the earth, feeling as though we are unworthy, unacceptable, not belonging. And yet I find the King coming. I find the King searching. I find the King knocking, drawing us back, not referring to our past, not our problems or our pain, but calling us and saying, son, daughter, child, it's time to come home. It's time to let me restore all the things that have been stolen from you. It's time for you to come back home and to eat at my table that I have prepared for you. Jesus calls us to himself and invites us to sit at the table with him. And here's the thing, that as I sit at the table, as you and I scoot up together close, as we get to the table, the beautiful part of the table is that it hides the crippled parts of our legs. It hides the broken things that are there. And we sit next to fellow individuals that have been crippled like we have been crippled. We see former sinners that are now saints, and we're all gathered around the table of God. And we understand we don't deserve this, but the grace and mercy of God came looking for all of us. And now all together we sit eating at the table, enjoying the blessings and the goodness of God. Like Mephibosheth, we are sons and daughters of the King. Man, what a beautiful story. A story all of us can relate to and understand. So tonight I ask you, take just a moment and spend some time sharing, reflecting, just talking with one another. How that God found us in our crippled state. Yet that is not what he calls us. He called us his sons and his daughters and his children. All of us can talk about how God has rescued us and how God has changed us. Your leader is going to guide you through some questions here tonight, and I hope you'll take just a moment and share with each other. And truly, every one of us has a tremendous story. You too are a Mephibosheth. Man, God bless you.